Now, in a penetration testing class, you would talk about assessment tools in much more detail, and you would use these tools and try these tools and see how they work. Also, an ethical hacking course, you would also do this. But in this class, I just want to talk about some of the basic tools that we have available to us in doing an assessment. And some of those tools are port scanners, banner grabbing tools, protocol analyzers, vulnerability scanners, honeypots, and honeyNets. These are all things we have in our toolbox that we can use to assess our own vulnerabilities and understand where our vulnerabilities are and how these threats might use these vulnerabilities against us. Now, it's important to note that if we have access to all these tools, our attackers do as well. So our attackers will be using these same tools that you learn about to check for our vulnerabilities. So it's important to be aware of the tools, not only so we can assess our own vulnerabilities, but to understand the tools that attackers might be using to attack us. I'm sure most of you have had some networking classes, so you understand what ports are. I think I've actually explained some of this in this course earlier, but TCP/IP networks exchange information between programs running on one system, with corresponding process running on a remote system. And basically, the port number is how we multiplex IP communication. So port numbers allow us to have multiple connections to a single system. So each packet or datagram contains a source port and destination port, so it knows which application it's trying to communicate with. So the thing about ports is, number one, there's a lot of ports between 0 and 65,000, so lots of possible port numbers, but it's typical for different applications to use well-known port numbers. So ports numbered from 0 to 1023 are reserved for universal applications. In other words, very well-known applications that are commonly used on the internet will be somewhere between 0 and 1023. And then you have registered port numbers from 1024 to 49,151. These are other applications. So if you develop your own application or your own protocol, you can register for a port number that's going to be used for your application. And then anything that's over 49,000 is available for use by any application. These are dynamic port numbers, and these are usually used when you dynamically need to listen on a port. For example, if you're initiating a connection to another server or another computer, you'll dynamically bind to some port in the 49,000 to 65,000 range. And it's usually kind of random how it assigns these ports, the sockets library, when you bind. And it doesn't matter if somebody else in the world is also bound to that port, because this is just for traffic coming back to you. So it's only relevant within your own computer, so you don't have to worry about ports being reused. So these are some of the common port numbers, and your book has this list as well. So FTP, SSH, which is port 22. Then you have SMTP, DNS, HTTP, which is probably one of the most common, and of course HTTPS 443, terminal server on 3389. So these are some of the various port numbers that are commonly used. And of course, there's a lot more than just these. There are many common port numbers, but this is just a short list of some of the common port numbers. Now, what should happen in most normal circumstances, if you find a server that's listening on port 80, in all likelihood, that server is listening for web traffic. It's listening for, for HTTP on that port number, or 443, likewise for HTTPS. And that's the basic idea. So if I use a port scanner and I see that it's listening on one of these ports, I can probably guess as to what service is running on that port by knowing what the port number is and mapping it to the to some of these common uses of those ports. So because port numbers are associated with applications and services, if the attacker knows which port is accessible, they might know what service is being offered from that particular server. So port security is implemented by disabling unused application and service ports to reduce the number of threat vectors. In other words, if you have a web server that's only listening for traffic on port 443 and 80, why have any other ports that are open or available? So it reduces the possibility of an attack. So you want to basically deny access to any port except for the two ports that you're interested in receiving traffic on that particular machine. A port scanner is one way where you can see what's open on a server. And you might be surprised if you take a Windows server that's not behind a firewall, run a port scanner, you may find that there are many ports that are open that you weren't aware of. And that is unless, of course, you're running a good firewall. If you turn the firewall on a Windows server. So a port scanner is the software that can search a system for any open ports or any ports that can be accessed. And it could also be through some kind of flaw. Some of the port scanners can also access ports by trying to take advantage of certain flaws. So there are three port states. You have an open port, which is a listening port. So some applications is bound to a port that's listening for information. You have closed, which is there's no process listening at the port, and you have blocked, where it does not reply to any inquiries at that port number at all, which is obviously the best option to block it. If it's not open, you should have it blocked. Here's an example of what a port scanner might look like. This is Radman. This is a kind of a free little port scanner that you can use, and you can see you put in the IP address or a range of IP addresses. You can even put in ranges of ports, and it will go through and scan. You can see in this example that this has scanned a system and found that port 21, 25, and 110 are open. And there's probably more listed if we were able to scroll through that picture. Of course, we can't, but you get the general idea. So with port scanning, the TCP connect scanning, that is where the scan attempts to connect to every available port. And if the port is open, the operating system completes the three-way handshake. And you have TCP SYN scanning, which is where you send a SYN packet to see if you get an acknowledgement back. TCP FIN scanning is when the port scanner sends a FIN message without first sending a SYN packet. So a closed port will reply, but an open port will ignore. So if you send a FIN packet to a closed, it'll reply. So this is just a way to figure out whether it's an open or closed port. And then a Christmas tree port scan is a packet with every option set to on for whatever protocol is in use. We've talked about the Christmas tree attack before. You light up all of the options in a TCP segment to try to see what happens, see what you get back, which might give you some clues, A, as to what's happening on the other side, what type of software they're running and so forth, and B, you might be able to crash the other system. So a banner grabbing tool is basically a tool that, and I could probably show you this. Some of you might recognize this from the labs, but I just logged into DunX1 or Dunks1, and the banner is this part right at the top where I don't really have to guess as to which operating system is being run on that server. It tells me after I log in. Now, of course, it does this after I log in, not before I log in. So after I log in, it tells me that it's Sun OS 5.1. Now, Drexel also runs an SMTP server. So I'm going to try to connect to that port. So I'm going to try to connect to port 25 on this server. And when I do that, I get a banner. I didn't log in or anything. I just immediately got a banner. So if I were using a banner grabbing tool, rather than just scanning the ports, it also checks to see if there's a banner that comes back that gives it some additional information that it can try to fingerprint exactly what they're running on that machine. So you can see here, this particular banner tells me that they're using the ESMTP package and it's version 8.14.4 for Sun 8.14.4. So that gives me a tremendous amount of information, more than just a simple port scan. So a lot of these banner grabbing tools, they take that message and they basically store it and do some evaluation on that. And in many cases, even if the banner doesn't tell you what version of software is running, sometimes that can be determined from other factors in addition to just what's written in the banner. So sometimes there's additional information there that the tool can use to figure out. There's typical behaviors in how it communicates and things like that it can figure out if it's running Apache, maybe even what version of Apache, if it's, say, a web server. And by the way, I just telnet it to an SMTP server, but if you telnet to lots of different TCP services, you'll get those banners that tell you what's running on that particular port. So again, an easy way for an attacker to try to figure out what you're running. So protocol analyzers basically are hardware and software that captures packets to decode and analyze the contents. So they're typically used by network administrators for troubleshooting. But again, attackers can also use this against us. You can characterize network traffic and do security analysis. So here's some of the information that you might find from a protocol analyzer. Vulnerability scanners is a generic term for a range of products that look for vulnerabilities in networks and systems. In many cases, the vulnerability scanners also use some of the techniques that I've just talked about, in addition to some more advanced technologies that they might have. So it's intended to identify vulnerabilities and alert administrators to these problems. And most of them maintain a database that categorizes and describes vulnerabilities that it can detect. So here's an example of a vulnerability scanner or some vulnerability software. In most cases, you would install this on a server somewhere, and it would be constantly evaluating things on the network and raising alerts when it finds that there's a condition that might cause some sort of vulnerability. So an alert can be set up when new systems are added to the network. So you know if somebody added a system that maybe needs to be baselined or needs to, maybe is deviated from the baseline. Detects when an application has been compromised or subverted. Detects when an internal system begins a port scan on other systems. So if you go into work and you start doing a port scan, a vulnerability scanner that's hopefully there would probably be able to tell the administrators that you're doing that. So probably not a good idea, at least without getting some permission. It can detect what ports are served and which ports are browsed for each individual system, identify which applications and servers host or transmit sensitive data, maintain a log of interactive network sessions. So lots of interesting things that you can do with vulnerability scanners, and I think a complete IT security infrastructure would probably include some kind of vulnerability scanning capabilities. I've said this before, but a lot of the lines between these different applications are sort of blurred now. A firewall can also do vulnerability scanning. Many firewalls have this capability. Intrusion detection and prevention systems also can be a vulnerability scanner. Sometimes an intrusion detection and prevention system is also the firewall, which is also the vulnerability scanner. So again, the lines are kind of blurry here, but it's important to identify what functionality you need. Where you get that functionality from is really up to you, but it's important to understand that it exists and that this is something that's probably important for a complete IT security infrastructure. And to that end, with all these different applications we have that can do all these things, one of the problems that has come up with, which happens in just about every area of any industry in IT, is you've got all these proprietary standards for how to store and evaluate these vulnerability assessments. So the Open Vulnerability Assessment Language was developed to try to normalize all of the different tools so that you can use the results from these different tools between different vendors and different software companies and even different open source products. So basically, it's a standard way of storing the results of these vulnerability assessments so that they can be used across different tools, and different tools can share information. For example, if you have an intrusion detection system, then it may want to aggregate information that's coming from, say, a vulnerability scanner and incorporate that information into the intrusion detection system. But the only way that can happen is if the software can interpret the results from some other software. So OVAL, or the Open Vulnerability Assessment Language, allows that to happen. And here's an example of some sample output from an application using OVAL. So Honeypots and HoneyNets, basically, and I hesitate to say that these are assessment tools. Honeypots and HoneyNets are kind of a gray area, but basically a honeypot is a computer protected by minimal security, but you've intentionally put some vulnerabilities on this particular machine. Your hope is that with a honeypot, the hope is that an attacker is going to see the low-hanging fruit of this honeypot, and they're going to go after the honeypot instead of your real assets. There's really kind of two reasons you would do this. Number one is to kind of trick attackers into showing what the techniques are that they're using for their attacks. So you can, since it's a known system that has these vulnerabilities, that you've kind of made it a target for the attackers. You know to monitor it, and you can see how it gets attacked and understand how attackers are doing things. And you can even set up HoneyNets, which are networks of honeypots. So it looks like an entire infrastructure to the attackers. So they feel like they're in a real environment. And of course, they're not. They're in this little protected walled garden that we've set up for them to basically attack in a protected environment. The other reason you might do a honeypot or a honeynet is simply to have a diversion from your real target. A good example of that is Area 51, right? A lot of people, know the stories about Area 51, and they have, about aliens and all that stuff. The reality is probably that Area 51 is just a research facility, but the government doesn't seem to try very hard to combat those stories, because stories of alien spaceships is, number one, so far out there that most people don't believe it, but number two, a lot more interesting than some benign research on systems that can avert radar detection or something like that. So that's probably the reality.